There are islands that appear on maps as coordinates, and there are islands that exist only as distance. Far out in the South Pacific Ocean, over 600 kilometers off the coast of Chile, lies part of a scattered volcanic chain known as the Juan Fernandez Islands. The land rises abruptly from deep water. There are no gradual shores. Cliffs form first, then narrow strips of uneven ground, and above them, steep ridges covered in dense vegetation. Wind moves constantly across the terrain. It carries salt from the ocean and moisture from passing weather systems. Rain falls without pattern. Some days remain clear, but the air rarely settles. The temperature is moderate, though exposure over time alters its effect. Fresh water exists, but it does not gather in large bodies. It moves instead through small streams that cut through the island's interior. These are not visible from the sea. There are no natural harbors. Ships do not pass close unless forced by weather or navigation error. From a distance, the island offers little reason to approach. It presents no signal. No smoke. No movement. For long stretches of time, nothing changes here. The ocean continues its motion. The land remains fixed. The island does not announce itself, and it does not record who arrives. Alexander Selkirk was born in 1676 in Lower Largo, a coastal village in Fife. The settlement faced the North Sea. Its economy depended on fishing and small-scale trade. From an early age, movement across water was part of daily life. Records from his early years are limited. Parish documents confirm his name and family. His father was a shoemaker. There is no detailed account of his education, though it is likely he learned practical skills rather than formal study. By his late teens, Selkirk had already left the village intermittently, returning between voyages. In 1703, he joined an English privateering expedition during the War of the Spanish Succession. Privateering was a legalized form of naval warfare. Crews were authorized to attack enemy shipping under government commission. Profit depended on captured cargo. Selkirk served as a sailing master, a role responsible for navigation and the handling of sails. It required technical competence rather than rank authority. His position suggests experience at sea beyond that of an ordinary sailor. The expedition itself was not structured for stability. Ships were often poorly maintained. Supplies were inconsistent. Crews were drawn from mixed backgrounds, and discipline varied between captains. Long voyages increased the risk of illness, mechanical failure, and conflict among men. Selkirk's decision to join such a voyage placed him within a system defined by uncertainty. Movement was constant, but control was limited. Outcomes depended on weather, judgment, and the condition of the vessel. By the time the expedition reached the Pacific, these variables had begun to narrow. The expedition that carried Alexander Selkirk into the Pacific consisted of two ships, the St. George and the Cinque Ports. Both operated under the command of William Dampier, though each vessel maintained its own captain and crew. Selkirk served aboard the Cinque Ports, commanded by Thomas Stradling. The ship had already seen extended use before the voyage. Its structure showed signs of wear. Maintenance at sea was limited, and repairs depended on available materials and calm conditions. The mission followed established privateering routes along the western coast of South America. Spanish shipping lanes offered potential targets, but they also required long periods of waiting and repositioning. Success was irregular. Weeks could pass without encounter. Food supplies began to deteriorate over time. Preserved goods lost quality. Fresh provisions were rare unless obtained from land. Water storage required constant monitoring. Leakage and contamination were common problems on long voyages. Discipline aboard the Cinque Ports was not uniform. Accounts from the expedition suggest disagreements between officers and crew. Authority depended heavily on the captain's judgment, and decisions were not always accepted without resistance. By mid-1704, the ship's condition had declined further. The hull showed signs of damage, likely from marine organisms and prolonged exposure. This affected speed and maneuverability. More critically, it raised concerns about seaworthiness during extended travel. Selkirk, in his role as sailing master, had direct awareness of these issues. His responsibility required him to evaluate navigation and the vessel's performance. Observations of the ship's condition were not abstract. They were immediate and practical. As the expedition moved westward across the Pacific, the margin for error narrowed. The ship continued forward, but its limitations had become increasingly visible. In September 1704, the Cinque Ports approached one of the islands in the Juan Fernandez Islands. The ship required maintenance, and the island offered temporary access to fresh water and a place to inspect damage. Landing was not unusual under such conditions. Crews often used isolated islands for repair and resupply. The process, however, depended on time, coordination, and the judgment of the captain. During the stop, Alexander Selkirk raised concerns about the condition of the ship. His role as sailing master placed responsibility on him to assess its readiness. Available accounts indicate that he believed the vessel was no longer safe for extended travel. The hull had weakened. Prolonged exposure to seawater had likely allowed wood-boring organisms to damage its structure. This reduced its reliability in open ocean conditions. Selkirk argued that continuing the voyage would place the crew at risk. His position was direct. He requested to remain on the island rather than return to the ship. Captain Thomas Stradling did not accept this assessment. Authority remained with him. Disagreement between officers was not uncommon, but refusal to follow orders carried consequence. At this point, Selkirk made a decision that shifted his position permanently. He chose to stay. The expectation may not have been long-term isolation. Islands in this region were occasionally revisited. Another ship could arrive. The decision, at that moment, did not guarantee abandonment. He was left with limited supplies. Contemporary records suggest he retained a musket, powder, tools, clothing, and a Bible. These were standard personal and professional items, not provisions for extended survival. Once the Cinque Ports departed, the distance between ship and shore increased quickly. There are no records of hesitation from the vessel after departure. The ship continued its course into open water. Selkirk remained on the island. The separation, at first, was physical. Its duration was not yet defined. When the Cinque Ports departed, Alexander Selkirk was left with the resources he carried ashore and what the island could provide. The location within the Juan Fernandez Islands offered fresh water, vegetation, and animal life, but no human presence or infrastructure. He initially remained near the shoreline. This allowed continued observation of the sea in case another vessel appeared. Visibility from the coast was limited, but it was the only practical vantage point for signaling passing ships. Selkirk's first priority was shelter. Using tools and materials salvaged from the ship, he constructed a basic structure inland. The shelter was made primarily from wood and natural cover. It provided protection from wind and rain rather than comfort. Its placement reflected a balance between access to resources and distance from the exposed shoreline. Food sources on the island were limited but sufficient for survival. The island was known to contain feral goats, introduced during earlier centuries by passing ships. These animals had adapted to the terrain and reproduced without control. Selkirk hunted them using a musket when available, and later through direct pursuit when ammunition was scarce. He also relied on plants, fish, and shellfish found along the coast. Preparation methods were simple. Cooking was done over open fires. Preservation was minimal due to environmental constraints. Over time, Selkirk established a routine. He divided his activities into practical categories: securing food, maintaining shelter, and preserving equipment. His survival depended on consistency rather than improvisation. Tools required repair. Clothing degraded under constant use. Fire had to be maintained regularly. Exposure to weather presented ongoing challenges. Rainfall affected both shelter integrity and the ability to keep supplies dry. Wind influenced movement across the island and made certain areas difficult to access. The absence of other humans removed the need for social coordination, but it also eliminated shared labor. All tasks required individual effort. There was no division of responsibility. Every function, navigation, hunting, repair, and maintenance, fell to one person. Selkirk adapted his movements to the terrain. He learned the locations of freshwater sources and areas where animals were more likely to gather. Familiarity with the environment became essential. Over time, repeated routes formed across the island, creating an informal pattern of movement between shelter, water, and hunting grounds. Clothing and footwear eventually deteriorated. Replacement depended on available materials. Animal hides were used when possible. These required preparation and maintenance to remain usable in the island's humid conditions. Fire remained central to survival. It provided heat, allowed cooking, and served as a deterrent to certain animals. Keeping fire alive required continuous attention, especially during periods of rain. Selkirk's tools, though limited, were maintained carefully. The musket, when functional, provided a means of hunting at distance. When it could not be used, hunting relied on proximity and physical endurance. Ammunition was finite and had to be rationed. Time passed without structured markers. There were no calendars or external references to define duration. Daily cycles were inferred from sunlight, weather, and routine rather than measurement. Despite isolation, the environment itself imposed a rhythm. Resource collection followed predictable patterns. Survival became a sequence of repeated actions rather than isolated decisions. Over months, these patterns stabilized. Selkirk's activities became systematic. The island did not change significantly, but his ability to operate within it improved. As time progressed on the Juan Fernandez Islands, the absence of external reference points became a defining condition of daily life for Alexander Selkirk. There were no clocks, no calendars, and no interaction that could anchor time to shared human activity. Days were distinguished only by environmental cues. Sunrise and sunset marked the passage of light. Weather patterns, rain, wind, and periods of calm, provided additional variation. These indicators replaced structured timekeeping, forming a cycle that was observed rather than recorded. Selkirk carried a Bible, which served as one of the few written materials available to him. Historical accounts indicate that he read from it during his time on the island. In the absence of other texts or communication, reading became a form of engagement with language and memory, rather than exchange. His routine remained centered on essential tasks, securing food, maintaining shelter, and preserving tools. These activities continued in repetition, with adjustments based on seasonal changes and resource availability. Over time, familiarity with the island reduced uncertainty in movement and decision-making. Isolation affected perception of time in a gradual way. Without events or interactions to mark progression, intervals between similar activities began to lose distinction. The repetition of similar days created continuity rather than contrast. There are no records of detailed personal logs or diaries from Selkirk's time on the island. Most knowledge of his experience comes from later accounts compiled after his rescue. These accounts describe a man who maintained functionality over an extended period without external structure. Physical condition required ongoing management. Injuries, exposure, and fatigue were unavoidable in such an environment. Recovery depended on rest and limited self-care. There was no access to medical assistance. Minor issues had the potential to become serious if neglected. The psychological effects of isolation are difficult to measure directly in historical cases. However, Selkirk's continued adherence to routine suggests a reliance on structure as a stabilizing factor. Maintaining consistent activities reduced the need for uncertain decision-making. Interaction with the environment became increasingly predictable. Locations for water, food, and shelter were known through repeated use. This reduced the cognitive burden of navigation and allowed focus on immediate survival tasks. Sound played a limited role in awareness. Ocean waves, wind, and animal movement were the primary ambient noises. In the absence of human voices, these natural elements formed the background of daily experience. The island itself remained unchanged in appearance over time. Vegetation, terrain, and climate followed natural cycles. Without development or alteration, the landscape provided continuity rather than variation. Selkirk's existence on the island became defined by repetition, observation, and adaptation. Time passed, but it did not accumulate in measurable units. It was experienced through continuity rather than count. During the later period of his isolation on the Juan Fernandez Islands, Alexander Selkirk continued to follow the routines he had established. These routines remained centered on securing food, maintaining shelter, and preserving the limited equipment available to him. Over time, physical strain became more apparent. Hunting required sustained effort, particularly when relying on pursuit rather than firearms. Movement across uneven terrain, combined with repeated activity, placed stress on the body. Recovery was limited to rest periods, which were not structured but instead dictated by necessity. Exposure to environmental conditions also accumulated. Rain, humidity, and temperature fluctuations affected both materials and health. Clothing and shelter degraded gradually, requiring ongoing maintenance. Materials sourced from animals or vegetation could be used, but their durability was limited compared to manufactured supplies. There are no direct records detailing specific injuries or illnesses experienced during this period. However, prolonged isolation in such conditions typically increases vulnerability to minor wounds and infections. Without external assistance, recovery depended entirely on natural healing processes and personal care. Selkirk also faced the challenge of sustaining interest in repetitive tasks. The lack of variation in daily activity meant that survival required continued adherence to routine even when conditions did not change significantly. This consistency was essential to maintaining access to food and shelter. Attempts to signal passing ships are noted in historical accounts. When vessels were observed at a distance, Selkirk would attempt to attract attention. The success of these efforts was limited. Ships traveling along established routes did not always pass within visible range, and visibility itself could be affected by weather and distance. The passage of time remained difficult to measure. Years accumulated without external confirmation. There were no records kept on the island to mark intervals or events. Memory became the primary means of tracking duration. Despite the limitations of his environment, Selkirk maintained his presence on the island without documented abandonment of routine. His survival depended on repetition, adaptation, and the continued use of available resources. As the years progressed, the possibility of departure remained uncertain. The island provided the conditions necessary for survival, but not for reintegration or communication. In February 1709, nearly 4 years after he had been left on the island, Alexander Selkirk was discovered by an English privateering expedition led by Woodes Rogers. The expedition had been navigating the Pacific as part of a broader privateering mission. One of its ships, the Duke, approached the Juan Fernandez Islands for resupply and reconnaissance. From a distance, the crew observed signs of human presence on the island, an unusual and unexpected detail in such a remote location. Upon closer approach, they encountered Selkirk. Historical accounts describe him as dressed in clothing made from animal skins. His condition reflected prolonged exposure to the environment, though he was able to move and communicate upon contact. Initial interaction required adjustment on both sides. The crew had to assess whether the individual posed any risk or required assistance. Selkirk, in turn, had to re-engage with human presence after years of complete isolation. He was brought aboard the ship and examined by the crew. Over time, he provided information about his identity and how he had come to remain on the island. These details aligned with the known history of the Cinque Ports expedition and his earlier decision to stay ashore. Selkirk remained with the expedition as it continued its voyage. He eventually returned to England with Rogers in 1711. Contemporary accounts of his condition upon rescue vary in detail, but they consistently indicate that he had survived independently for an extended period without external contact. His discovery marked the end of his isolation, concluding a continuous period of survival that had lasted several years. After his return to England, Alexander Selkirk was noted in maritime and literary accounts for the duration of his isolation and the conditions under which he survived. His experience became one of the most documented castaway cases of the early 18th century. Selkirk did not remain continuously in public life for long. He eventually returned to seafaring, though the details of his later voyages are less extensively recorded. He died in 1721 at sea. His survival on the Juan Fernandez Islands became widely known through written accounts, including narratives that influenced later literature. One of the most notable works associated with his story is Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, which drew inspiration from real survival accounts of the period. Selkirk's case remains significant in historical studies of isolation, navigation, and early modern maritime practices. It stands as a documented example of prolonged human survival under conditions of complete separation from society. If you would like to explore more verified historical survival cases like this, reviewing primary voyage records and contemporary journals can provide deeper context into how such expeditions were conducted and recorded.